plan to speak today as an evangelist for science. And I was going to be 100% optimistic. But having heard Ray Kurzweil yesterday extolling our exponential approach to utopia, I felt impelled to start off with a few gloomy thoughts. So I'll begin by talking as an anxious member of the human race. My credentials here are that, though an astronomer, I wrote a book which I entitled Our Final Century, ? The British publishers took out the question mark, here we are. The American publishers retitled it, Our Final Hour. Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. And it's updated, if I could put in a plug, in my new book, From Here to Infinity, in all good bookshops. Well, these books discuss two types of threat. One is the threat that we impose collectively on the environment because there are more of us, each of us consuming more resources. That's familiar. But the second, and more relevant to this conference, is the kind of threat that stems from misuse of ever more powerful technology. Well, of course, any new technology entails risks. In the early days of steam, people died when poorly designed boilers exploded. But something's changed. If a boiler explodes, it's horrible, but there's a limit to just how horrible. But there are new hazards that could be so catastrophic, even global, that even a tiny probability is disquieting. And we're all vulnerable to breakdowns of elaborate networks, electricity grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, and so forth. And it's crucial to ensure maximum resilience of all such systems to hacking or systemic failure. And there are other vulnerabilities. Synthetic biology, for instance, offers huge potential for medicine and agriculture, but there are risks. Already the genomes for some viruses, polio, flu, and SARS, have been synthesized. Worse still, experts are learning what can make them more virulent or more transmissible. And expertise in such techniques will become widespread, posing a manifest risk of bioerror or bioterror. And all of us in education are kidding ourselves if we think that those with technical expertise will all be balanced and rational. Expertise can be allied with fanaticism, not just the traditional fundamentalism that we're so mindful of today, but that exemplified by some New Age cults, extreme eco-freaks, violent animal rights campaigners, and the like. Weirdos with the mindset of those who now unleash computer viruses, the mindset of arsonists. So the global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have a global impact. So in a future of vast individual empowerment, the future Ray Kurzweil envisaged, even one malign act could be too many. So how can we feel safe? Maybe we need less intrusion, less privacy, and more intrusion. Maybe that'll happen anyway, because the rash abandon with which people put their details on Facebook and our acquiescence in CCTV everywhere means that a shift of that kind would lead to little resistance. Or will there be pressures to constrain diversity and individualism, like the movie Minority Report? Well, I don't have any answers. I'm an astronomer, not an astrologer. But I'm worried that in 2040 we won't be acclaiming the singularity, we'll be desperately trying to minimize these existential risks. Well, that's enough gloom. Let me now focus more on science. Scientists are all too often in grumbling mode, especially about education. They moan that the public doesn't understand them and isn't interested in what they do. But I think they complain too much. Public ignorance isn't peculiar to science. It's indeed sad if some people can't tell a proton from a protein, but it's equally sad if they don't know their nation's history, can't speak a second language, or can't find North Korea or Syria on a map. And, of course, many can't. Indeed, I'm gratified and surprised that so many people are interested in dinosaurs, the Large Hadron Collider, the Hubble telescope, or alien life, or blazingly irrelevant to their everyday lives. And we should be grateful, of course, to David Attenborough, Rob Winston, Brian Cox, and other popular writers and TV presenters for amplifying this interest. But even without media encouragement, the very young have a natural interest in science, whether focused on dinosaurs, tadpoles, or space. And the challenge for educators is, of course, to sustain this interest through and beyond the primary school stage. Space is something of special interest, and I'm very proud of this picture signed for me a few years ago by 7 of the astronauts who walked on the moon. Manned space flight inspires very many people. Well, the enthusiasm of young people often isn't sustained, as we know, because formal education in science is suboptimal. More than 2/3 of primary school don't have a single teacher with a science qualification. Many pupils never get exposed to a graduate in physics or in maths, even in secondary school. So all too often, their enthusiasm has been stifled by the time they leave school. And that's sad, because science is important for its own sake. It's a cultural deprivation not to appreciate the wonderful panorama offered by modern cosmology, DNA, and Darwinian evolution. This common understanding should transcend all national differences. It's part of global culture, though it does yet have to penetrate US Bible Belt, Kentucky and places, and parts of the Islamic world. Several speakers have rightly highlighted the huge educational upside from computers and the web. That's been a big theme of this meeting. But I want to make a slightly Luddite remark, just to please the chairman, and point out a countervailing effect, which makes it harder now to engage young people with science. And this is that they are more distant from real reality. Newton, when he was young, made model windmills and clocks, the high-tech artifacts of his time. Darwin collected fossils and beetles. The young Einstein was fascinated by the electric motors and dynamos in his father's factory. And 50 years ago, inquisitive children could take apart a clock, a radio set, or a motorbike, figure out how it worked, and put it together again. But it's different today, of course. The gadgets that pervade young people's lives, iPhones and such like, are baffling black boxes, pure magic to most people. Even if you take them apart, you'll find few clues to their arcane miniature mechanisms, and you certainly can't put them together again. So the extreme sophistication of modern technology, wonderful though its benefits are, is ironically an impediment to engaging young people with the basics, helping them to learn how things work. Likewise, today's city dwellers are more distanced from the natural world than earlier generations were, and this is a real loss. By the way, I'm using the word science in a broad sense to encompass technology, education, computing, etc. And this is not just to save words, but because they are linked not only in education, but in the world. Problem solving motivates all of us, whether one's a cosmologist like myself or an engineer facing a down-to-earth design problem. There's at least as much challenge in the latter. A point neatly made by an old cartoon which shows two beavers looking up at a hydroelectric dam. One beaver says, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." And I like to remind my Blue Skies colleagues that the Swedish engineer who invented the zip fastener made a greater intellectual leap than many of them ever will. I also advise them, by the way, to read science fiction. It stimulates the mind. It's better to read first-rate SF than second-rate science. It's more entertaining and no more likely to be wrong. And we do want to attract the brightest and best of the next generation into science. And here, prominent role models will be helpful, preferably not all male, grey, and stale. We need the nerds, but we can't get by with just the nerds. A decade ago, BBC TV ran a series of programmes to identify 100 greatest Britons. The advocates of Darwin and Newton slugged it out among the final 6. But it was the third contender, Brunel, and he surprisingly did better than either of the other two. There were 2 reasons. First, his advocate was Jeremy Clarkson. Second, there were rumours that students from Brunel University voted early and voted often. Nonetheless, this was an all too rare instance of a great engineer being publicly acclaimed. The other finalists, by the way, were Churchill, Shakespeare, and Princess Diana. But Brunel is long dead, so why can't more of our top scientists and engineers have the profile of our leading architects, say, of people like Foster and Rogers? It's good that James Dyson, for instance, is pushing for this cause, but engineers are frankly terrible at PR. They don't highlight their leading individuals. There are concerns in the United States about fostering scientific talent. Back in the 1950s, the launch of Sputnik galvanized the US into strengthening its science. And in a speech last year, President Obama said that the US faced another Sputnik moment, and that spearheading science, education, and research would be the engine of economic recovery. He gave a nice metaphor. If you're on an aeroplane that's overweight, it doesn't help to throw out an engine. And this message, important for the US, is even more important for us here. We mustn't get trapped in a downward spiral. And of course, if you look globally, there is a tectonic shift in the international balance. By mid-century, it'll be Asia that constitutes the world's physical and intellectual capital. That's where it'll be concentrated. We're seeing the end of 4 centuries of Western hegemony. But we shouldn't deplore this. It's not a zero-sum game. Just as there's more creativity per capita in a big city, so there will be more in the world now per capita, now we're networked globally. Now we're all immersed in a cyberspace that's ever more information-rich and sophisticated. And that's been a big theme of this meeting. As Ray Kurzweil said, there will be huge enhancements in computer power via the future manifestations of Moore's law and perhaps via further qualitative advances like quantum computing. This will have 2 huge consequences. First, it will have an ever greater role for simulations in, say, simulating the climate, but especially in subjects like my own, in astronomy, where we can't do experiments on galaxies. We can't crash 2 galaxies together and see what happens, but we can do this in the virtual world of our computer. And here is a computation of 2 galaxies crashing together, a sort of train wreck, and they eventually will merge. This is speeded up 10 to the 15 from real time, but the Andromeda galaxy will hit us in 4 billion years, and this sort of thing will happen. So be warned. So computer simulations will be more and more important. And a second benefit of computers is that data mining, mashing, etc., will be a new route to discoveries. Indeed, it'll be a new kind of science. Discoveries worthy of Nobel Prizes will be made by brute force rather than by insight, just as a world chess champion is a machine. Moreover, these discoveries can be made, unlike in the past, by people based anywhere in the world. For example, astronomical information used to be stored on delicate photographic plates, which weren't easily accessible and were tiresome to analyze. Now such data And likewise, large data sets in genetics or particle physics can be accessed or downloaded anywhere. And one benign consequence of this is that the internet allows millions to participate in frontier science. For instance, in the Galactic Zoo project, spearheaded at Oxford University, images of 3 million galaxies. Like these here, this shows a tiny patch of sky. It would take 100 patches like this to cover the full moon in the sky, but look at all the galaxies there. Classifying these could be labor intensive, but the work's being shared by thousands of keen amateur astronomers, many of them of school age. And in biology, 40,000 PlayStation 3 enthusiasts explored the combinatorial options for protein folding, via folding at home. And I'd like to spend a few moments talking about another nice example of citizen science, discovering new planets. Just a word about this. One of the most exciting discoveries in the last 10 years is to realize that the stars you see at night aren't just twinkling points of light. Most of them are orbited by a retinue of planets, just like the familiar planets orbiting our sun. And we would love to find out more about them. In particular, whether there are any planets like the Earth out there, maybe even possible abodes for life. Well, one technique that's being used is symbolized here. If you're looking at a star and the planet moves across in front of it, if you're in the plane of the orbit, then the star will get slightly dimmer because the planet blocks out a bit of its light. If an Earth-like planet moves in front of a Sun-like star, the dimming is about 1 part in 10,000. The Kepler spacecraft, launched 3 years ago, has a telescope that's pointing at the same patch of sky in Orion, in the Cygnus and Lyrae constellations, a patch about 7 degrees across, and it's monitoring the brightness of 150,000 stars in that part of the sky, and it's repeating this at least twice an hour for all of them, with a precision of 1 part in 100,000. And what it's searching for, of course, are cases when you see a regular dimming as a planet comes by again and again. Well, last year, tentative detections of planets were released. Thousands have been detected already. One star was found to have no fewer than 6 planets, and one planet was orbiting a double star. It would be 2 suns in your sky if you were on that planet. But there's a huge amount of data from Kepler. Time series lasting several years for more than 100,000 stars. And amateurs can now search this database, hoping to find the telltale periodic signals that correspond to an orbiting planet. In fact, some of you may have watched the BBC stargazing program last week, where they interviewed a chap, I think from Nottingham, who had found a planet. And there'll be many like that. A great achievement to find another planet. There's, of course, a long tradition of amateur contributions to astronomy, but what's more surprising is that wiki-style activity is now catching on in mathematics. My Cambridge colleague Tim Gowers, one of the world's leading mathematicians, has a website where there's genuine collaboration in proving theorems. Maths used to be solitary, but advances in understanding can now be cooperative, like completing a jigsaw, or indeed like the development of open source software. And as regards the communication of science, electronic methods are leapfrogging the traditional channels for publishing original research. Scientists are very old-fashioned. They normally publish scientific papers in a journal. And the scientific journal was invented by someone called Henry Oldenburg, who was the first secretary of the Royal Society in the 1660s. And in one of the first issues, there was this wonderful picture. This was Robert Hooke, who was Newton's least favourite FRS, who had the first microscope. He was a wonderful draftsman, and he drew pictures of insects. This is a flea seen through one of the first microscopes. Well, this journal was a model for the tens of thousands of journals that now exist. Well, the concept which Oldenburg had was a breakthrough in the 1660s, but it's surely obsolete today. Indeed, most researchers in my subjects all over the world post our papers on a web archive established by a guy called Paul Ginsparg, now at Cornell University. And we read that daily. And indeed, going further, it's not clear to me that the scientific paper will remain the preeminent publishable unit for professional scientists. The refereeing role of journals may one day be trumped by more informal systems of quality control. Blogs and wikis and social networks will play a bigger role in critiquing and codifying science. So the legacies of Gutenberg and Oldenburg aren't optimal in the age of Zuckerberg. So what about the impact of new technologies on teaching? Well, other institutions are following MIT's lead in posting videos of lecture courses online, and as we heard in the last talk, Stanford went a step further by web streaming live a popular course on artificial intelligence given by two eminent professors, Norvig and Froome. And as we heard, 150,000 people signed up and 20,000 stayed the course. And these students were given interactive quizzes and they get a certificate at the end, though not regular Stanford credits. Now, that seems to be very good. 20,000 people, far more than the actual classroom reach of that course, having gained almost as much as those in the live audience. So that seems to be a very, very encouraging innovation. Distance learning, of course, can't replace the personal mentoring by faculty that happens in the better universities. But I think it may well erode demand for the traditional mass university, like many on mainland Europe and in India, where all the students get are a passive role as part of a large audience in lectures generally of mediocre quality, with minimal feedback. Instead, the internet will offer them access to a growing menu of outstanding lectures and courses. And the Open University's well-tried model, distance learning supplemented by a network of local tutors and so forth, has vastly more potential, of course, in the age of the internet and the smartphone than when the Open University was founded, in the era of black and white television. So I think there'll be a deepening bifurcation between, on the one hand, universities and colleges that really offer personal mentoring and tuition, and on the other, the Open University model. The mass university, I think, may be squeezed out. At the school level, too, these technologies can be transformative, or at least supplementary, the Khan Academy, etc. And, of course, they can give not just professors, but some classroom teachers a global reach, but can never eliminate the need for high-quality professionals in the classroom. And, of course, the shortage of such teachers is one of the big problems, and I don't have time to discuss remedies here. Well, finally, let's recall a key reason why science education is important, apart from simply it being part of our culture. It's important because today's young people will grow up in a world ever more dependent on elaborate technology, but also more vulnerable to its failures and misuse, as I said earlier. Society needs to address questions like who should access the readout of our genetic code, how will lengthening lifespans affect society, should we build nuclear power stations or wind farms to keep the lights on, can the world support 9 billion people, should we use insecticides or plant GM crops, should the law allow designer babies. Choices on all these things can't and shouldn't be made just by scientists. They need wide public discussion. But for that discussion to rise above mere tabloid slogans, everyone needs a feel for science, for our environment, and a realistic assessment of risk. And that's the challenge for teachers. That's why we should maximize the educational upside from computers and from the web. But I want to end by echoing what Ellen MacArthur said yesterday about a sustainable future. We need a change in priorities and perspective, and soon, if all the world's people are to benefit from our present knowledge and from the further breakthroughs that this century will bring. It's urgent to apply new technologies optimally and to avoid their nightmarish downsides, to stem the risk of environmental degradation, to develop clean energy, and to ensure that we don't, in 2050, still have a world where billions live in poverty and the benefits of globalization aren't fairly shared. We need to broaden young people's sympathies in both space and in time, so that they act as global citizens and perceive themselves as part of a long heritage and stewards for an immense future. I'll close with a personal perspective which strikes me whenever I visit a cathedral. This is Ely Cathedral. The builders of this cathedral lived in the fens. They'd probably mainly never been more than 100 miles. Even the most educated of them knew of nothing beyond Europe. They thought the world was a few thousand years old and that it might not last another 1,000. But despite these constricted horizons in both time and space, despite the deprivation and harshness of their lives, despite their primitive technology and meager resources, they built these cathedrals, though they knew they wouldn't live to see them finished. And their legacy still elevates our spirits nearly a millennium later. What a contrast this is to so much of our discourse today. Unlike our forebears, we know a great deal about our world, and indeed about what lies beyond. Many phenomena still make us fearful, but the advance of science spares us from irrational dread. We know that we are stewards of a pale blue dot in this cosmos, a planet with a future measured in billions of years, a planet whose fate depends on humanity's collective actions this century. But all too often, the focus is short-term and parochial. We downplay what's happening even now in impoverished, far-off countries. We give too little thought to leaving a fair inheritance from our grandchildren. And widening these perspectives is surely a prime educational goal. So that's my final thought. Thank you very much. New Age cults, extreme eco freaks, violent animal rights campaigners, and the like. Weirdos with the mindset of those who now unleash computer viruses, the mindset of arsonists. So the global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have a global impact. So in a future of vast individual empowerment, the future Ray Kurzweil envisaged, even one malign act could be too many. So how can we feel safe? Maybe we need less intrusion, less privacy, and more intrusion. Maybe that'll happen anyway, because the rash abandon with which people put their details on Facebook and our acquiescence in CCTV everywhere means that a shift of that kind would lead to little resistance. Or will there be pressures to constrain diversity and individualism, like the movie Minority Report? Well, I don't have any answers. I'm an astronomer, not an astrologer. But I'm worried that in 2040 we won't be acclaiming the singularity, we'll be desperately trying to minimize these existential risks. Well, that's enough gloom. Let me now focus more on science. Scientists are all too often in grumbling mode, especially about education. They moan that the public doesn't understand them and isn't interested in what they do. But I think they complain too much. Public ignorance isn't peculiar to science. It's indeed sad if some people can't tell a proton from a protein, but it's equally sad if they don't know their nation's history, can't speak a second language, or can't find North Korea or Syria on a map. And, of course, many can't. Indeed, I'm gratified and surprised that so many people are interested in it. If I could put in a plug in my new book, From Here to Infinity, in all good bookshops. Well, these books discuss two types of threat. One is the threat that we impose collectively on the environment because there are more of us, each of us consuming more resources. That's familiar. But the second, and more relevant to this conference, is the kind of threat that stems from misuse of ever more powerful technology. Well, of course, any new technology entails risks. In the early days of steam, people died when poorly designed boilers exploded. But something's changed. If a boiler explodes, it's horrible, but there's a limit to just how horrible. But there are new hazards that could be so catastrophic, even global, that even a tiny probability is disquieting. And we're all vulnerable to breakdowns of elaborate networks, electricity grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, and so forth. And it's crucial to ensure maximum resilience of all such systems to hacking or systemic failure. And there are other vulnerabilities. Synthetic biology, for instance, offers huge potential for medicine and agriculture, but there are risks. Already the genomes for some viruses, polio, flu, and SARS, have been synthesized. Worse still, experts are learning what can make them more virulent or more transmissible. And expertise in such techniques will become widespread, posing a manifest risk of bioerror or bioterror. And all of us in education are kidding ourselves if we think that those with technical expertise will all be balanced and rational. Expertise can be allied with fanaticism, not just the traditional fundamentalism that we're so mindful of today, but that exemplified by some new. Well, I plan to speak today as an evangelist for science, and I was going to be 100% optimistic. But having heard Ray Kurzweil yesterday extolling our exponential approach to utopia, I felt impelled to start off with a few gloomy thoughts. So I begin by talking as an anxious member of the human race. My credentials here are that, though an astronomer, I wrote a book which I entitled Our Final Century, ? The British publishers took out the question mark, here we are. The American publishers retitled it, Our Final Hour. Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. And it's up to